Open your Bibles, if you would, to the Gospel according to Luke. We're going to be reading from the 14th chapter. Today we're going to talk about the stuff we love to hate. The dreaded B word, the budget. Ooh. We're going to have a good time doing it, though. See, the fun thing about money is that if you will happen to your money, then you will have some. If you just let your money happen to you, then you'll never win. It's what Zig Ziglar used to say. If you aim at nothing, you'll hit it every time. And most people, that's what they do with their money. They don't aim at anything. They just go. And that doesn't work. John Maxwell's definition of a budget is telling your money what to do instead of wondering where it went. A budget removes our decisions from the immediacy of the moment and the emotional impulse to spend, and impulse spending is the bane of financial well-being. So here's the deal. You've got to tell your money what to do. You've got to make it behave. Otherwise, you're going to wake up 20 years from now, 6 decades from now, and say, I've had all this money running through my hands, and I wonder where it went. So it's like I told you last week. Money has this principle to it. It's current. It moves. That's why it's called currency, and it's going everywhere. So if you don't get on top of that money and make it behave, you'll always wonder where it went. You will either tell your money what to do, or the lack of it will always manage you. Stephen Covey said in his book on the 7 Habits of Highly Effective People that highly effective people are proactive. They happen to things rather than waiting for things to happen to them. You must do a written cash flow plan every single month. Jesus said it this way, as recorded in the Gospel of Luke, chapter 14, verses 28 through 30. For which of you, desiring to build a tower, does not first sit down and count the cost, whether he has enough to complete it? Otherwise, when he has laid a foundation and is not able to finish, all who see it begin to mock him, saying, This man began to build and was not able to finish. When Jesus talked about building a tower, he was not, of course, talking directly about our household budgets. He was speaking of a timeless, practical wisdom. Planning, preparation are essential to achieve our goals, and this has never been more true than in the area of our money. We should notice 2 things. First, Jesus' stress on planning and completing a task is a timely warning given today's concerns about finances. Being mocked for failing to budget properly contrasts with our reluctance to come to grips with our own budgets. Secondly, Jesus uses a financial analogy to illustrate discipleship, reminding us that how we manage money is intimately related to the integrity of discipleship. A budget is an aid to the obedience which discipleship requires. You would never build a tower without a plan. Don't run your life without a plan. Think about it this way. The average household income in the United States is $50,000 a year, according to the U.S. Census Bureau. So over 10 years, that's $500,000. You're going to have, if you're going to have $500,000 run through your hands in any 5 or 10 year period, you need to have a plan. You would never build a $500,000 house without a plan. If you're going to build a $500,000 house, you wouldn't walk out on the lot with a contractor and say, I think we'll stick it over there. You wouldn't do that. You'd have a plan, and that plan is known as a blueprint. And every single detail of that house is on this plan. All the plumbing is in there. It shows where all the faucets are, where all the drains are. There's all the electric is in here, where all the plug-ins go, the light switches, the elevations is on here, the woodwork is in here, the fans are in here. Even the landscaping is detailed. So you wouldn't build a $500,000 plan or house without a plan. Why are you going to run your life without a plan? And yet, we'll allow that to go on, and then we wake up and say, whoa, where did it go? I feel so inept. Why are you inept? This isn't rocket science. You just have to do it. You have to have a blueprint. You have to have a game plan. You would never build a $500,000 house without a plan. Well, this is so intimidating. I know it's intimidating. So is being broke. So is being out of control, not knowing where you're going. That's intimidating too. So when you start doing this stuff, you're not going to do it perfectly. Think back when you started riding a bicycle. You didn't just jump on it and go. You wobbled around, probably fell a few times, skinned up your knees, but you learn by getting back on it and keep practicing and keep working on it. A budget's going to be the same way. Your budget, when you first start, is not going to work. The first time you sit down with your spouse and you get that nerd and free spirit together, your first budget committee meeting, and you lay it all out, the first month you'll have 17 emergency budget meetings. The second month you're going to have about 12. The third month you'll have about 3 or 4. It takes 3 months of doing this to get this stuff right. And if you do it right over and over again, finally, after about 90 days, you'll start to have a clue. The first budget is going to be a disaster. And the first budget committee meeting may be a big fight, unless you're very careful with your relationship. Because it's going to bring out a whole bunch of stuff that's not been dealt with for a long time. So you just have to look that demon in the eye. And I'm not talking about your spouse. This is a process where it's going to take a little bit of trial and error, because you guys have to figure out what your deal is. You can't take somebody else's budget and say, oh, this is how it's done. This is going to reflect your value system. Your personal stamp will have to be on this. But it's like Grandma used to say. Grandma said, practice makes perfect. And that's the deal with the budget. The first month's going to be rough. Second month will be a little better. Third month, it'll actually start to work a little bit. And by the time you've been doing this over and over for years, the whole process will take you about 20 minutes, and you'll wonder how you ever did without it. But it's trial and error, and it takes practice. So give yourself a little bit of grace in this process. Another part of your plan will have to be to keep your accounts balanced. If you don't have your account balanced within 72 hours of receiving your bank statement, you have a system that's broken your money. And I get people who come in and they just stack these things up and they say, oh, I do that about once a year. And then they can't figure out why they don't have a clue about what's going on about their money. And keeping your accounts reconciled, it's not difficult, especially nowadays with all the computer programs that goes on that's replaced the old checkbook ledger. You know, it even does the math for you. But it's still up to you to keep track of the money that's in your accounts. And don't be like this one old boy who come in and for help trying to get his accounts balanced, and was working with him, and the numbers worked, but it didn't balance with the bank. You know what I mean? And kept coming across these entries that said ESP. So what's all these ESP entries? And he says error someplace. So don't do that. Overdrafts are a sign of crisis living and lazy, sloppy money habits. It's just a matter of taking the time to take care of your money. Do you know that the average millionaire, they can't tell you who got voted off the island, or who got the rose, or maybe who the biggest loser is, but their checkbooks balance. So don't say you know everything about the latest TV craze and you don't have a clue about your life. Throw a brick through your television. Spend a few hours on your own life so that you get to win. Automatic overdraft loans, according to the Center for Responsible Lending, will this year account for more than $10.3 billion in fees on American overdraft situations. It's a huge profit industry for the banking industry. They're feeding off the American public's incompetence. If not managed and made to behave, the ATM card and the debit card are certain to become budget busters. I've met people who didn't have a big credit card problem, but they're $20 themselves to death at the ATM with no accountability and no management of it. It's just out of control. And then what happens is that people make these little incremental, impulsive decisions, and they end up dying a death of 1,000 cuts. So the deal is this: you have to make your money behave, whether it's checks, whether it's debit cards, ATM cards, credit cards, whatever's going on, you have to control these situations. Now, there's reasons that people don't do a cash flow plan, and why most people hate the word budget, because it has a straitjacket connotation to it. They're afraid, oh, if I do a budget, I'm not going to be able to do what I want to do. I can't order a pizza. I can't do this. I can't do that. And it doesn't mean that at all. All it means is that you write it down and you have a plan. People don't like the word budget because it's been used to abuse them, either by a parent or a control freak spouse. It's not in the budget. It's not in the budget. It's not in the budget. Well, listen, if you're an adult and it's not in the budget, you can put it in the budget. You get a vote. So put it in the budget. And then if you look and it falls in the priority of things and it doesn't really make sense, then we learn a new word: no. It's an ancient word, one that has been totally removed from our vocabulary by political correctness, because you're not allowed to tell anybody no for any reason, including your kids. But it's a word that will set you free. You learn that word so you tell yourself no now, so you can tell yourself yes later. And then people don't do a budget because they never had one that really worked. When we did our first one, we pulled out the old yellow pad and started listing everything down and the expenses. Remember those? And then you get to the bottom and say, okay, here's what we're going to add it up. We're only going to eat every other week. So by day 2, you've wadded that thing up and you throw it away because it doesn't work. And I've already told you they're not going to work for 90 days, so you have to stay with it. Another reason people don't want to do a budget is because of the paralysis from fear, because they're afraid of what they're going to find. It's called denial. You look into the bill drawer and you say, ew, I don't want to reach in there. There's gremlins in there. Something may gnaw my hand off. I don't want to look in there. I'm afraid if I write everything down, it might be really bad. Well, guess what? It might be really bad. But it's better to face those fears and to take care of that so that you cleanse the wound and rather than let it go. So face those fears. And a lot of times when I'm helping people do this and they bring in this big box of stuff, you start working through it and you find out, oh, the last one's the only one we need. All of the rest of these are right here. This is the only one we have to deal with. And a stack like this ends up being a stack like this, and it's not near as bad as what they feared. We was helping one guy do his budget, and he come in the next week, he had it, and he said, Well, I found out we've been eating out too much. What do you mean you've been eating out too much? He said, we've been eating out too much. We added up all of our stuff in our budget, and we found out we've been spending $1,200 a month in restaurants. Oh. He says, yeah, I found out why we didn't have a retirement. We've been eating it. So cash flow plans don't work because a lot of times we leave things out. Now, we're going to go over some forms here with you in a little while. There's also some software out there online that'll help you go through this. But we leave things out, and then we think it doesn't work. We forget that Joey has baseball pictures this week. Or we forgot that we owe a down payment on Susie's class ring. We forget things and leave them out. And there's no perfect month. You can't do one and then just reproduce it every month. You have to do a different budget on paper, on purpose, before the month begins. The other reason we don't do a budget is because sometimes they're overcomplicated. The Nerd was on steroid overdrive, and it's 66 pages long. Nobody's going to live on that. You got to keep it simple so that you stay on it. And then people don't do cash flow plans because they make one and then they don't live on it. It's all theory. You have to actually live on the budget, on purpose, on paper. Write it all out. You have a game plan. You and your spouse, you spit, swear, and pinky shake. We've got a promise. We're walking together. We're walking forward. And then we go out and do something that we didn't write down. That doesn't work. You have to actually do what you write down. And you can never, ever spend any money again that's not on that paper. And if you don't like what you wrote down, whose fault is that? It's yours. So change it. If you want to change it, just change it. But if you change it, do it with your spouse, because you can't go home and say, hey, honey, look what I did. It doesn't work that way. You have to do this together. A cash flow plan, if actually created and lived on, removes the management by crisis from your finances. If you're struggling, things are really tight, maybe you're behind on some bills, and you really don't know what to do, we teach that first thing you have to do is establish 4 walls. You have to take care of your own household first, or you're worse than an unbeliever, the Bible says. So we take care of those 4 walls, and those are, number 1, food. You budget food before you do anything. And then your house and utilities. That's followed up by clothing and transportation, so you can get yourself back to work. You establish those 4 walls first, but 20 to 25% of the people who come in for counseling, they'll be current with MasterCard, or they'll be current on the student loan, and they're behind on their house. That's backwards. You don't pay some other goober somewhere while you fall behind on your house. You don't let your lights get turned off because you're paying some other goober somewhere. So this stuff, you have to keep it in perspective, and you have to set priorities. So what you do when you're struggling, you have a certain amount, and you start with those priorities, and you start down the line. And then when the money runs out, you draw a line, and nobody below that line gets paid. Now, I don't like that. I want to pay them, but there's no money. So you can't. You have to decide who's going to get paid and who's not going to get paid, and you set that priority with your spouse, and you do that before the collectors start calling and everybody starts screaming at you. You stay in control of where that line gets drawn. And then the other thing, of course, you have to do if you're in crisis is to assess the situation, find out how we're going to get some more income coming in. Maybe you have to work some overtime. Sometimes it's a second job. Maybe we're going to go out and sell something so that we can get this thing to balance. Managed money, when you make your money behave, it goes further. It's like Time management. When you manage your time, you have more time. The same thing works for money. Many people I've helped through this process, they come back later after they've gotten it done for a while, and they say, it feels like I've gotten a raise. It's because managed money has more muscle and it goes further. A written plan, if actually agreed on, removes the money fights from your marriage. It removes much of the guilt, shame, and fear that may be part of buying necessities such as food and clothing. Any of you in here ever been chewed out by your spouse for buying clothing? Be careful. Be careful. But when you do a budget and you agree on that in the first place, it takes that fight out of it. And then, excuse me, a written plan will also remove many of the overdrafts from your life, consequently removing a lot of stress. And we've already talked about how expensive that is. And it will show you where you are overspending in certain categories. Now, the easiest budget is the zero-based budget using the envelope system. And any extra money that comes from the muscle of managed money goes to whatever goal that you have next. We talked last week about building the emergency fund. So if you don't have that emergency fund in place, any extra money left over in the budget would go towards the emergency fund. And once that's done, then you go to your next step, whatever that might be. The zero-based plan is where every dollar has a name before the month begins. Income minus outgo equals exactly zero. So figure out what you're going to make this month and spend it on paper, on purpose, before the month begins, in agreement with your spouse. And if you're married, and if you're single, let your accountability partner look over that. And I'm going to go over that with you in a few minutes and show you how to do that. The envelope system used to be taught by Larry Burkett. Found out Larry didn't invent it either. Your grandmother did. Because it's been around forever. So some things we pay with automatic drafts on our checking account. Might be utilities, insurance, the cable bills, first of the month, whenever they just hit your account and it's taken care of. Others you're going to end up paying using checks. But we have certain areas in our budgets where we're spending little amounts throughout the whole month, and then we lose track of how much we've got left, and then end up busting our budget. And that's where the envelope system comes in. So what you do, when you get paid, maybe you're going to budget, let's say $500 for your food budget. So we'll make us an envelope, and we write food on the food envelope. And then you go get 500 cash, or maybe you get paid twice a week and it's $250, and you put that in there, and then you don't buy any food anywhere except out of this envelope. And you don't buy anything else anywhere that comes out of this envelope unless it's food. So then what happens when we get down towards the end of the month, we look in the food envelope, there's nothing in there. We don't go order a pizza. We stay at home and eat leftovers. Well, I deserve a pizza. You don't deserve that. You don't deserve your kids' college not getting funded because you wanted a pizza. Come on. So that's how you stay on track like that. I'm going to show you some forms here. We're going to go over this really quickly about how this budget process works. You guys also have these in your bulletins. If you got a bulletin, you got the forms that are in there. And the very first one is our income sources. And we've outlined all the income sources that you might have. And we're going to look at a month in the life of Joe and Susie, our mythical couple. And you see from the income sources that Joe makes a salary of $2,716. He gets paid on the first of the month. And then Susie gets paid $945 a month, and she gets that on the 1st and the 15th at $472.50 each pay period. So they have a total of $3,661. Now we're going to go to the actual expenses. And the very first thing you'll notice is charitable giving. The book of Proverbs says first fruits of your charitable giving. So we list that on the budget first. And you can see their tithers over in the right-hand side. They've got $366 over there. Then under savings, they have an emergency fund that they're funding of $244. There's nothing in the retirement or college fund this month. So that $244 goes over to the right-hand column. And then when we look at housing, they have a first mortgage payment of $915, and down towards the end of the list, you can see they're saving up to replace their furnace, so they're putting $50 aside for that. So you add the $915 and the $50, which comes to $965, and that goes into the right-hand column. And then we got utilities, electric at $100, water at $55, gas at $75, phones $45, the cable's $21, all of those total $296, and that goes into the right-hand column. And you keep going until you get down to this page. You total up the right-hand column, which comes to $2,491. And we go to the second page and do it again. They've got clothing expenses. Look, there's medical and health, which is insurance premiums and some doctor payments and dentist payments. And then we've got personal stuff like life insurance, hair care, organizational dues. Now down at the bottom is a category called blow money. This is the purpose of this is to make a realistic budget, because we all know we're going to blow some money. Other people have changed this to read pocket money. This is money that you put in your pocket that you can do with what you like. When I get paid, my wife goes to the bank, she writes a check for some cash. Part of that is her blow money, part of it's mine, and we can do with that whatever we want without any interference from the spouse. She spends most of hers on the grandkids. That's fine. I like to save mine because I keep score with it. It's just my thing. But when something happens and you have a shortfall in your budget somewhere, sometimes this is a good place to go get that without tearing up the rest of your budget. Also, if I decide that I want to take her out to a movie and the entertainment budget is already spent, I could reach into my blow and take her to the movies. So that's to do with whatever you like. But this thing is the grease that makes the skids of this whole budget thing work. So make sure you put something in the blow money. Total up those right-hand columns, that comes to $770. Then we go to page 3. We got entertainment budget of $50. Looks like they're saving for a vacation as well, so there's $25 there. And then we're paying on debts. We got $100 going to Visa, $75 to MasterCard, $50 to American Express, and $100 on the student loan. So the page 3 total comes to $400. We bring up pages 1 and 2 to this. We add them all together and comes up to $3,661 minus the income of the same amount equals 0. Now, you sit down to do this. Is the first time you go through this, is it going to come out exactly like that? No. So you'll have to go back. You'll either have a deficit or you'll have a surplus. You go back and adjust the categories until that figure equals 0. Don't do what one guy did in Financial Peace. He brought his budget in after the first week and he says, "Hey, guess what? I got $300 left over. I win." No, you didn't understand. Because if you leave $300 down there, the ants will carry it away. Because I know how this works. You'll be thinking in your head, I've got $300 extra. And then every time you go over the budget a little bit, well, I can make it up with that $300 that's extra. And you'll end up spending that $300 2 or 3 times. Don't do that. Make sure it equals 0. Now this next sheet, I've thought long and hard about including this because this gets me into a lot of trouble with the nerds. Joe and Susie, when you take their budget, the actual percentages are showed in the left-hand column for each category. In the far right-hand column is the recommended percentages. But what will all this is for is to tell you where you're at and if you're grossly overspending in something. But I'll have the nerds that come up and say, well, we see you don't recommend anything more than 15% for transportation, and our car payment is 15.38% of our income. Should we sell our car? No, it's a recommendation. But if you look at it and your car payment is 50% of your budget, then yes, you should probably either sell the car or make plans to move into it. The other part is this is income dependent. So if you make $1 million a year, I really don't want you spending 15% on food. You will be a very large person. So take this with a grain of salt and use it for what it's intended. Be very, very careful with this because it's yours ultimately. You have to do with it and put your stamp on it because this will display your value system. So, would you stand with me as Brother Joe comes to pray and give the invitation? Proverbs 10:15 says, "The wealth of the rich is their fortress. The poverty of the poor is their ruin." This proverb recognizes the pain of poverty and that adequate wealth allows us to flourish as human beings. A budget is a practical tool to manage what God has given us and entrusted to us, and it will pay dividends in your emotional well-being.
Thank you, Kelly. Over in the Gospel of Matthew, Jesus says this. He says, "For where your treasure is, there your heart will be also." You know, a lot of people say to me, well, you know, Pastor, you're coming to church for the next 4 weeks, and all we're hearing about is money. Yeah. The reality is that 100% of the couples that come in to see me for marriage counseling, money is either the number one or the number two problem they bring. The flat, honest reality is that most Americans are broke. We don't own anything. We're too far in debt. We're living really not even paycheck to paycheck. We're really a little behind from paycheck to paycheck. And the reality is most folks in our church are not prepared for a rainy day. What happens if something bad happens? What happens if the economy fails? What happens if the plants lay off? What happens if we go into another recession? You need to be prepared. It's good stewardship. Money's mentioned over and over. Kelly pointed out the other day, it's mentioned more often than heaven in the Bible. It's mentioned more often than many other concepts in the Scripture. And so we need to have our financial houses in order. And that starts with each family. This is practical biblical instruction on how to be a good steward of everything that God has given you. So I want you to bow your head with me, close your eyes. I'm going to have a word of prayer. Then maybe just something God has spoken to you about this morning in the message. Maybe you recognize today, you say, man, I need to get on a budget. I need to make a commitment to sit down with my wife, my family, and get on a simple budget to plan so my money isn't managing me, I'm managing it.